Hey everyone, I'm Peter Stories here to guide you today. If you use this video to drift off to sleep, please tap like, hit subscribe, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is there. Now settle in, get cozy, and let yourself relax. Benjamin Carter realized his daughter was missing at 4:47 p.m., when the October sun had already begun its descent behind the jagged peaks of Glacier National Park. The realization didn't come as a sudden shock, but as a creeping dread that had been building in his chest for the past 20 minutes. That peculiar parental instinct that something had shifted in the world, that the universe had tilted slightly off its axis. They had been hiking the Highline Trail, just the two of them, a father-daughter trip that Benjamin had promised Harper for months. His wife, Sarah, had stayed home in Kalispell, trusting him to keep their 8-year-old safe on what should have been an easy afternoon hike. The trail was well marked, popular even in late October, and Benjamin had hiked it a dozen times before. Harper had been walking just ahead of him, her pink backpack bouncing with each step, her voice carrying back to him as she sang some song from school. And then she wasn't there anymore. Benjamin stood frozen on the trail, his heart hammering against his ribs. "Harper!" His voice cracked as he called her name. "Harper, this isn't funny, honey." The wind carried his words away into the vast emptiness of the Montana wilderness. Around him, lodgepole pines stood like silent witnesses, their branches swaying in the cold breeze that smelled of coming snow. He jogged forward, scanning the trail ahead, then spun around and ran back the way they'd come, his hiking boots slipping on loose gravel. "Harper!" Nothing. Only the whisper of wind through the pines and the distant cry of a hawk circling overhead. Benjamin pulled out his cell phone with shaking hands. No signal. Of course there was no signal. They were miles from the trailhead, surrounded by wilderness in every direction. He checked his watch again. 4:51 p.m. It had been less than half an hour since he'd last seen her, but in this terrain, a child could disappear in seconds. A wrong turn, a hidden ravine, He forced himself to stop, to think rationally. He was a mechanical engineer, a problem solver. Panic helped no one. Harper was a smart kid. She knew to stay on the trail if she got separated. She had water in her backpack, a whistle on her jacket zipper. He had taught her what to do. But as Benjamin stood there in the growing shadows, something felt wrong beyond his daughter's absence. The forest had gone too quiet. No birds, no rustle of small animals in the underbrush, just that cold wind and the creaking of trees. And there was a smell, faint but unmistakable, like meat left too long in a freezer, like something organic and wrong. He started hiking back toward the trailhead at a near run, calling Harper's name every few seconds, his voice growing hoarse. As the trail descended through a section of dense forest, he noticed something that made him stop dead. Scratches on a tree trunk. Long, deep gouges in the bark, too high for a bear to have made while standing on all fours. 4 parallel marks, each one cutting into the heartwood of the pine. And below them, caught on the rough bark, a small tuft of pink fabric. Benjamin's hands trembled as he reached for it. The fabric was from Harper's jacket. He recognized the exact shade, the synthetic material. But the scratches made no sense. They were fresh, the exposed wood still light-colored, sap weeping from the wounds. "Harper!" His scream echoed through the forest. "Harper! Where are you?" By the time Benjamin reached the ranger station at Logan Pass, the sun had set completely, and the temperature had dropped below freezing. His lungs burned from running the last 2 miles, and his throat felt raw from shouting. He burst through the door of the small wooden structure, startling the ranger on duty, a weathered man in his 60s with a gray beard and deep-set eyes. "My daughter," Benjamin gasped. "She's missing. 8 years old, pink jacket. We were on the Highline Trail and she disappeared." The ranger's expression shifted immediately from surprise to something Benjamin couldn't quite read. Not shock, not even the kind of urgent concern Benjamin had expected. It was something darker, something that looked almost like resignation. "When?" the ranger asked, already reaching for his radio. "About 2 hours ago. Maybe 4:45, 4:50. The ranger, his name tag read Garrett Mills, clicked the radio and began calling for search and rescue, his voice steady and professional. But Benjamin saw the way Mills's jaw tightened, the way his fingers drummed against the desk between radio calls, the way his eyes kept flicking to a large topographic map on the wall, marked with various pins and notations. "We'll get teams out there immediately," Mills said after coordinating with other rangers. "Where exactly did you lose sight of her?" Benjamin described the location as precisely as he could, mentioning the scratches on the tree, the piece of fabric. Mills's face grew paler as he listened. "You said scratches? High up on the trunk?" "Yes, at least 6 feet up. I thought maybe, I don't know, a mountain lion, but they seemed wrong for that." Mills was quiet for a long moment, then stood abruptly and went to a filing cabinet. He pulled out a folder, hesitated, then set it on the desk between them. "Mr. Carter, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Did you see anything else unusual out there? Anything that seemed off?" "What do you mean off?" "My daughter is missing. Please." Mills interrupted, and there was something almost pleading in his voice. "Did you see anything?" Benjamin thought back to that moment on the trail, the unnatural silence, the smell, the way the light had seemed to change, as if the sun had dimmed despite there being no clouds. "It got very quiet," he said slowly. "And there was a smell, like rotten meat." Mills closed his eyes briefly, and when he opened them again, they held a terrible sadness. He opened the folder and turned it around so Benjamin could see. Inside were photographs, missing person reports. All children, all in Glacier National Park. The dates went back decades: 1969, 1977, 1983, 1991, 2001. 5 cases. 5 children who had vanished without a trace in the same general area of the park. "What is this?" Benjamin's voice was barely a whisper. "Every one of these disappearances happened in mid to late October," Mills said quietly. "Always near the High Line Trail, always during the day, always children between 6 and 10 years old. And in every single case, witnesses reported the same things you just described. The silence, the smell, and scratches. Those goddamn scratches, high up on tree trunks nearby." Benjamin felt his legs weaken. He gripped the edge of the desk. "Why haven't I heard about this? Why isn't this all over the news?" "Because we never found any of them," Mills said. "Not a single body. Not a piece of clothing beyond initial evidence at the scene. Nothing. After a while, the Park Service stopped connecting the cases publicly. Easier to treat them as individual tragedies than admit we have a pattern we can't explain." He paused. "Or that we're too afraid to explain." "What are you talking about?" Mills pulled out another document. This one older, the paper yellowed with age. It was written in careful handwriting, dated 1957. "Before this was a national park, this land belonged to the Blackfeet Nation. Some of it still does technically. The tribal elders. They've always said this area is cursed. They have a name for what lives here." Mills's voice dropped even lower. "Naya Pius Pawasin, the hunger that walks, a corruption of their trickster god, twisted into something else, something that feeds." "This is insane," Benjamin said, but his voice lacked conviction. He kept seeing those scratches, kept smelling that awful odor. "The Blackfeet say it's a spirit that went mad, that violated the natural order by consuming human flesh during a terrible winter centuries ago. It's trapped between worlds now, neither human nor animal, neither living nor dead, and every autumn when the veil between worlds grows thin, it hunts." Mills met Benjamin's eyes. "It prefers children. Their fear is purer." Benjamin wanted to laugh, to dismiss this as the ravings of a superstitious old man. But he couldn't, because somewhere deep in his primitive brain, in the part that still remembered when humans were prey, he believed every word. "How do I get her back?" The question came out as a broken whisper. "Mr. Carter, how do I get my daughter back?" Mills flinched at the desperation in Benjamin's voice. For a long moment, the only sound was the ticking of the clock on the wall and the howl of wind outside. "The Blackfeet have stories," Mills finally said. "Old stories, about how their ancestors would sometimes venture into the spirit world to retrieve lost souls. But it required sacrifices, and most who tried never returned." "I don't care," Benjamin said immediately. "Tell me everything." The search and rescue teams arrived within the hour, experienced wilderness trackers with thermal imaging equipment and search dogs. Benjamin joined them as they headed back into the darkness, their flashlights cutting narrow beams through the absolute black of the mountain night. The temperature had dropped to the low 20s and a light snow had begun to fall. The dogs picked up Harper's scent immediately at the location Benjamin described, then followed it for perhaps 50 yards before stopping abruptly. The lead handler, a woman named Chen, frowned as her German shepherd whined and backed away from an unremarkable section of trail. "That's weird," she muttered. "He's never done that before." They searched through the night, spreading out in a grid pattern, calling Harper's name until their voices gave out. Benjamin refused to rest, pushing through exhaustion and cold until Mills finally pulled him aside around 3 a.m. "You need to stop," the ranger said. "You're no good to anyone if you collapse out here." "She's 8 years old and it's below freezing," Benjamin said through chattering teeth. "Every minute that passes." "I know." Mills gripped his shoulder. "But there's something else you should know. That place where the dog stopped? I checked it with UV light. There were symbols there painted on the rocks with some kind of organic compound. Old symbols, Blackfeet shamanic markings that are supposed to denote a threshold between worlds." Benjamin stared at him. "What does that mean?" "It means your daughter might not be in our world anymore." The words hung in the cold air between them, impossible and yet somehow inevitable. Benjamin thought of Harper's laugh, her obsession with dinosaurs, the way she still held his hand when they crossed streets. His little girl. "Then I'll go to wherever she is," Benjamin said flatly. Mills was quiet for a moment, then nodded slowly. "There's someone you need to meet. He lives on the reservation, just outside the park boundary. His name is Thomas Whitecalf. Well, some would call him a medicine man, though he doesn't like that term. If anyone can help you, it's him." They drove to the reservation as dawn broke over the mountains, painting the snow-covered peaks in shades of pink and gold that seemed obscene in their beauty. Benjamin sat in silence, his mind cycling through memories of Harper, teaching her to ride a bike, reading bedtime stories, the proud smile on her face when she learned to tie her own shoes. Each memory felt both precious and like a knife twisting in his chest. Thomas Whitecalf's home was a small house with traditional decorations, medicine wheels, dream catchers, and strings of prayer beads hanging from the porch. The man who answered Mills's knock was perhaps 70, with long gray hair and a face mapped with deep lines. His eyes, though, were sharp and alert, and they studied Benjamin with an intensity that made him uncomfortable. "You're the father," Whitecalf said. It wasn't a question. "Yes, my daughter Harper, she—" "I know what happened," Whitecalf interrupted. "I felt it. The boundary was crossed yesterday. A child was taken. Can you help me?" Benjamin heard the desperation in his own voice and didn't care. Whitecalf gestured for them to enter. The interior of the house smelled of sage and something else, something sharp and medicinal. He led them to a room at the back, where artifacts covered every surface. Feathers, bones, stones carved with symbols, bundles of dried herbs. "The thing that has your daughter," Whitecalf began, settling into a worn chair, "is what my people call Napius Powassan. It was once a man, a member of our tribe, who became so consumed by hunger during a terrible winter that he resorted to eating the dead. This act corrupted his spirit, and when he died, he didn't move on to the spirit world. Instead, he became trapped between realms, forever hungry, forever hunting." The ranger said something similar. Benjamin said impatiently, "But how do I get Harper back? The entity exists partially in our world and partially in the spirit realm. When it takes someone, it brings them to a place where the boundaries blur, a threshold space that overlaps both realities. If you want to retrieve your daughter, you must enter that space. But understand, Mr. Carter, It's not meant for living humans. The spirit world is. It will try to keep you. And if Napis Pawasan becomes aware of your presence, it will hunt you too. I don't care. Tell me how. Whitecalf studied him for a long moment, then nodded. You'll need to perform a ritual. It will require your blood, and it will require you to fast and prepare your mind. And it must be done at the threshold, the place where your daughter was taken. How long will all this take? If we begin now, you can attempt the crossing tonight at midnight. That's when the veil is thinnest. Tonight, then, tell me what to do. The day passed in a haze of preparation. Whitecalf gave Benjamin instructions: what to eat, nothing after noon; what to carry, sage, tobacco, a knife; what to say, prayers in Pikuni that Benjamin practiced until his tongue felt clumsy and foreign. Mills stayed with them, making calls to the ongoing search effort, his face growing grimmer with each report of nothing found. Benjamin barely heard any of it. He was focused entirely on what lay ahead, on the impossible task of entering a world that shouldn't exist to find a daughter who might already be lost. As midnight approached, they returned to the trail. Mills drove them as far as the road would allow, then they hiked the final distance by flashlight, their breath forming clouds in the freezing air. The snow had stopped, but the temperature continued to drop, and everything was coated in a thin layer of white that glittered in their lights like crushed diamonds. At the threshold spot, the place where the dog had refused to continue, where Whitecalf's UV light had revealed ancient symbols, they stopped. Whitecalf set up a small circle of stones and built a fire using wood he'd brought. As flames began to lick at the kindling, he handed Benjamin a small knife with a bone handle. You must cut your palm, Whitecalf instructed. Let the blood fall on the threshold stones. Blood is the bridge between worlds. It carries life force, and life force is the key to crossing over. Then you must smoke the sage and speak the words I taught you. Keep your mind focused on your daughter. Your love for her is your anchor. Don't let go of it, no matter what you see or hear. Benjamin took the knife with steady hands. He was past fear now, past doubt. There was only purpose, only Harper. He drew the blade across his palm, feeling the sharp bite of pain and the immediate warmth of blood. He squeezed his fist, letting drops fall onto the symbols carved into the rocks. In the firelight, they seemed to shimmer, to writhe like living things. Whitecalf lit a bundle of sage, and Benjamin breathed deeply of the smoke, feeling it burn his lungs. He began to chant the words he'd learned, his voice low and rhythmic. Nitsitapi, Kitakiwa, Omaksipi, Kitakiwa, Naapis Oki Ai. The words felt strange in his mouth, ancient and powerful. As he spoke them, the world around him began to change. At first, it was subtle, a slight blurring at the edges of his vision, a sense that the forest had grown deeper somehow, more layered. Then, with a sensation like stepping through a membrane, everything shifted. The fire was still there, but now it burned with colors Benjamin had no names for, hues that hurt to look at directly. The trees had multiplied, existed in multiple states at once, their branches reaching into dimensions his eyes couldn't quite process. And the stars had gone wrong. They weren't in fixed positions anymore, but seemed to swirl and pulse, forming patterns that whispered secrets at the edge of comprehension. He turned to look for Mills and Whitecalf, but they were gone. Or no, not gone. He could see them, but they were frozen, existing in a single moment while he had somehow stepped outside of time's normal flow. They looked like statues made of flesh, their faces locked mid-expression. Harper, Benjamin whispered, and his voice echoed strangely, bouncing back from angles that shouldn't exist. He started walking into the forest, following an instinct he couldn't explain. The ground beneath his feet felt solid and insubstantial at the same time, as if he were walking on the surface of water. The trees around him whispered in voices that might have been wind or might have been the murmuring of countless lost souls. After what might have been minutes or hours, time had no meaning in this place. Benjamin heard it, a sound that made every hair on his body stand on end, a wet, rasping breath, and then a whisper, carrying from somewhere ahead. Papa. Harper's voice. But wrong, stretched thin, as if the word were being pulled from her by force. "I'm coming, baby," Benjamin shouted, and he began to run. The forest twisted around him, paths appearing and disappearing, reality folding in on itself. He saw things in the spaces between trees, shapes that defied geometry, entities that watched with too many eyes or no eyes at all. They reached for him with appendages made of shadow and bone, but Benjamin pushed through, his mind fixed on Harper, on his love for her, on his desperate need to hold her again. And then he saw it. The thing stood in a clearing that shouldn't exist, in a space where multiple versions of the forest overlapped like shuffled photographs. It was tall, impossibly tall, with limbs that bent at wrong angles, and a torso that seemed to shift between human and animal. Its skull was elongated, covered in matted fur and exposed bone, with antlers that branched into the sky like leafless trees. But worst of all were its eyes, human eyes, filled with such profound hunger that Benjamin felt his sanity threaten to crack just from meeting its gaze. And there, huddled at its feet, was Harper. She was alive, but her eyes were glazed, unfocused, as if she were trapped in a waking dream. Her lips moved soundlessly, and Benjamin could see trails of tears frozen on her cheeks. The entity, Napis Pawasan, turned its massive head toward Benjamin. When it spoke, its voice came from everywhere and nowhere, a sound like wind through empty ribs. Another sacrifice, another soul to sustain. "Let her go," Benjamin said, his voice surprisingly steady. "Take me instead." The entity tilted its head, and Benjamin realized with horror that it was amused. "You offer yourself? Foolish, father, you don't understand what you are. I'm her father. That's all I need to be." The entity laughed, a sound like branches breaking under ice. "Love. Such a sweet flavor. I've tasted it before. Always. Tastes best in fathers." And then it moved, faster than anything that size should be able to move. Benjamin threw himself forward, putting his body between the entity and Harper. He felt impact, massive, crushing, and then he was flying through the air, landing hard against a tree that existed in 3 places at once. Pain exploded through his body, but he forced himself up. He could see Harper more clearly now. She was bound by something that looked like shadows made solid, like threads of darkness wrapped around her small body. The entity was advancing, its massive form blotting out the strange sky. Benjamin reached into his pocket, finding the sage and tobacco Whitecalf had given him. His hands shook as he pulled them out, as he began to speak the protective prayers he'd been taught. The words felt clumsy, inadequate against this ancient hunger. But something changed. The entity slowed, its head swinging back and forth as if sensing something it hadn't expected. The sage smoke, even in this twisted realm, carried power. Benjamin could feel it, a warmth spreading from his hands, a connection to something older than the entity, older than hunger itself. "You should not be here," the entity hissed, and for the first time Benjamin heard something other than predatory amusement in its voice. He heard concern, maybe even fear. "Neither should you," Benjamin said, and he moved forward, holding the burning sage like a weapon. "You were human once. You can be freed." "No!" The entity's roar shook the clearing. "I am eternal. I am hunger. I am necessary." But Benjamin could see it now. Beneath the horror, beneath the corruption, there was still something human in those eyes. A man who had made a terrible choice in a moment of desperation, who had been punished beyond measure, who had forgotten what it meant to be anything other than hunger. "You don't have to be," Benjamin said quietly. "You can rest." He touched the sage to his bleeding palm, mixing ash with blood, and he spoke words Whitecalf had taught him. Old words. Words of release and forgiveness. The entity screamed, a sound that Benjamin felt in his bones, and then it began to change. The massive form started to shrink, to collapse in on itself. The antlers fell away like dead branches. The fur and exposed bone melted like snow. And standing there, shaking and small, was simply a man. Gaunt, ancient, and impossibly tired. "Thank you," the man whispered. And then he was gone, dissolving into light that scattered into the strange sky. The moment the entity vanished, the shadows binding Harper released her. Benjamin ran forward, scooping his daughter into his arms. She was cold. So cold. But she was breathing, and her eyes focused on his face with sudden clarity. "Daddy," she whispered. "Where are we?" "Going home, baby. We're going home." But the spirit realm was collapsing around them now, no longer sustained by the entity's presence. Benjamin clutched Harper to his chest and ran, following the pull of the living world, the tug of his own body waiting back at the threshold. Reality fractured and reformed, pressing in on all sides. He heard voices, Mills, Whitecalf, calling his name from impossibly far away. And then he felt it, that membrane again, separating worlds. He pushed through it with every ounce of strength he had left. Benjamin gasped, his body jerking as if he'd been shocked. He was lying on the ground next to the fire, Mills and Whitecalf leaning over him, their faces tight with concern. And in his arms, shivering but alive, was Harper. "Daddy," she sobbed, burying her face against his chest. There was a bad man, a hungry man. "I know, baby. I know, but he's gone now. He's finally at rest." Mills was on his radio immediately, calling for emergency services. Whitecalf simply nodded, satisfaction and relief clear on his weathered face. He began to gather his materials, putting out the fire with careful precision. As they waited for the rescue helicopter, as dawn began to break over the mountains for a second time, Benjamin held his daughter and felt the full weight of what had happened settle into his bones. Part of him still didn't believe it, couldn't believe it. But Harper was real and warm in his arms, and that was all that mattered. Later, much later, after Harper had been checked by doctors and declared miraculously healthy despite her ordeal, after statements had been given and reports filed, Mills pulled Benjamin aside. "The official report will say she wandered off trail and suffered from exposure-induced confusion," the ranger said quietly. "No one would believe the truth anyway." "The other children?" Benjamin asked. "The ones from before?" Mills shook his head. "Lost forever, I'm afraid. Without the entity to maintain that threshold space wherever they were, it's gone now." Benjamin felt a weight of sorrow for those families, for the closure they would never have. But he also felt a deeper truth, that sometimes the most important thing wasn't understanding everything, but simply saving the one life you could. As they drove away from Glacier National Park, Harper asleep in the back seat, Benjamin looked back at the mountains one last time. In the morning light, they looked beautiful and innocent, just another stunning landscape that tourists would photograph and hikers would explore. But Benjamin knew better now. He knew that the world was thinner than people imagined, that ancient hungers still walked the earth and that some borders were never meant to be crossed. He also knew that love, pure, desperate, paternal love, was sometimes strong enough to cross them anyway. 3 weeks later, Benjamin received a package in the mail. Inside was a small medicine pouch on a leather cord and a note in Whitecalf's careful handwriting. "For the child. Protection. What you did freed more than just one lost soul. The ancestors are grateful. Wear this always." Benjamin showed it to Harper, who was slowly readjusting to normal life, though she still had nightmares and refused to go into any forest. She took the pouch with curious fingers. "It's pretty," she said. "What's it for?" "To keep you safe," Benjamin told her, helping her put it on. "From the hungry things." Harper looked up at him with eyes that had seen too much for 8 years. "There's nothing that hungry anymore, Daddy. You made him stop being hungry. You saved him." And Benjamin realized she was right. He hadn't just rescued his daughter. He'd freed something that had been suffering for centuries, trapped in its own corruption and pain. In the end, the monster had been as much a victim as anyone. But late at night, when he couldn't sleep, Benjamin would still smell that awful scent of frozen meat and hear the wet rasp of hungry breath. He would remember the feeling of existing between worlds, of seeing reality's seams exposed, and he would get up to check on Harper, to watch her sleep peacefully in her bed, to remind himself that she was real and safe and home, because he knew now what lurked in the spaces between, and he knew that the veil between worlds was thinner than anyone wanted to believe, especially in October, when autumn stripped away summer's protections and winter's grip had not yet descended. Some hungers, Benjamin understood now, were eternal, but so too was a parent's love. And in the end, love had proven the stronger force. At least, for one child, for one father, for one night when the worlds had aligned and a desperate man had stepped beyond the boundary of reality itself to bring his daughter home. If this story gave you chills, which moment haunted you most? The entity's true nature, or Benjamin's journey between worlds? Christopher Marsh had built his reputation on facts. 17 years as a missing persons investigator, first with the FBI and now as a private consultant, had taught him that most disappearances followed predictable patterns. People didn't vanish into thin air. They left trails, made mistakes, succumbed to exposure or misadventure. The world operated according to rules, and Chris had made a career of understanding those rules better than anyone else. That certainty began to crack the moment he saw Megan's campsite. It was late September 2009, and the aspens in Glacier National Park had turned to gold, their leaves trembling in the cold Montana wind like thousands of nervous fingers. Chris had driven up from Missoula at the request of Dr. Patricia Reeves, head of the anthropology department at the university where Megan Sullivan had been a doctoral candidate. Megan had been conducting field research on traditional Blackfeet spiritual practices, specifically focusing on historical shamanic rituals in the remote backcountry of the park. She'd been due back 5 days ago. Her truck was still at the trailhead, keys locked inside. Park rangers had found her base camp intact but abandoned. Everything still there. Ranger Tom Whitehorse had told Chris during the briefing at park headquarters. Tom was Blackfeet himself in his 50s, with deep lines around his eyes that suggested he'd seen more than he cared to discuss. Tent, sleeping bag, research equipment. Her satellite phone is in the tent, turned off. Food cache untouched. It's like she just walked away from everything. How long was she supposed to be out there? Chris had asked, taking notes in the leather-bound journal he'd carried for years. Writing things down helped him think, helped him see patterns. 2 weeks. She'd checked in by sat phone every 3 days like clockwork. Last contact was 12 days ago. Said she'd found something significant at one of the old ceremonial sites up near Lake Isabel. Sounded excited. Tom had paused, his jaw tightening. Maybe too excited. What does that mean? Some places up there. Tom had chosen his words carefully. Some places were marked as forbidden by my ancestors for good reasons. The anthropologists, they see it as superstition, cultural artifacts to be studied. But there are boundaries that shouldn't be crossed, Mr. Marsh. Lines that exist whether you believe in them or not. Chris had heard variations of this speech before, usually from well-meaning locals trying to add mystery to what would inevitably prove to be a mundane tragedy. He'd nodded politely, thanked Tom for the information, and requested a guide to take him to Megan's last known location. Tom had agreed, though something in his expression suggested resignation rather than hope. Now, standing in the clearing where Megan had made her base camp, Chris felt the first whisper of something that wasn't quite rational analysis. The site was exactly as Tom had described, meticulously organized with Megan's research materials carefully stored in waterproof containers, her camping gear arranged with the precision of someone who'd spent significant time in the backcountry. But there was something else, something that made the hair on the back of Chris's neck stand up in a way that annoyed him because he couldn't immediately explain it. The silence was wrong. Chris had been in wilderness areas across North America, and he knew the ambient sound of nature, wind through trees, bird calls, the rustle of small animals in the underbrush, the distant sound of water. Here there was only wind, and even that seemed muted, as though the air itself was holding its breath. No birds, no insects, nothing. You feel it too, Tom said quietly. It wasn't a question. I don't feel anything, Chris replied, more sharply than he'd intended. I'm observing an anomalous absence of wildlife, which could indicate a recent predator presence in the area. Bears, possibly a mountain lion. Right. Tom's tone suggested he didn't believe a word of it. Let me show you what we found. They walked to the far edge of the clearing, where Megan's tent was pitched beneath a cluster of ancient pines. Tom pulled back the entrance flap, and Chris ducked inside. The tent smelled of canvas and the faint lavender scent of whatever soap Megan had used. Everything was orderly. Sleeping bag neatly rolled, backpack organized, a small camp stove with cooking supplies. On a folding table, Megan had set up what amounted to a mobile research station. Laptop, external hard drives, a digital camera, and stacks of notebooks covered in neat handwriting. Chris pulled on latex gloves, habit from his FBI days, and carefully picked up the most recent notebook. Megan's final entries were dated 9 days ago, the day before her last satellite phone check-in. The writing was precise, controlled, the words of someone who understood the importance of documentation. September 18, 2009. Continued survey of the Lake Isabel area. Found what appears to be a ceremonial site approximately 3 miles NNE of base camp. Stone arrangements consistent with descriptions of historic Blackfeet Vision Quest locations, but with unusual variations. Multiple pictographs on rock face, including several symbols I haven't seen in any of the literature. Most disturbing, evidence of relatively recent activity. Ashes in the fire pit can't be more than a few months old. Who would be performing ceremonies up here? And why these particular symbols? Chris flipped forward. The next entry was longer, more detailed. September 19, 2009. Returned to the site alone. Note to self. Probably should have told someone specific location, but didn't want contamination before proper documentation. Spent 6 hours photographing and measuring. The symbols are definitely anomalous. Several appear to be Blackfeet in origin, but twisted, altered in ways that change their meaning. I found references in Turner's 1892 ethnography to corruption rituals that were strictly forbidden. ceremonies that inverted traditional practices to achieve spiritual power through transgression rather than harmony. The elders he interviewed refused to describe them in detail, said even speaking of such things could give them form. Superstition, obviously, but the fear was real. "This is interesting," Chris muttered, more to himself than Tom. She found something she thought was significant, some kind of historical ritual site being used for contemporary purposes. "Keep reading," Tom said from the tent entrance. He hadn't come inside, Chris noticed, hadn't even looked at the notebooks. The next entry was dated September 20th, the day of Megan's last contact. "Couldn't sleep last night. Kept hearing something outside the tent. Footsteps, I think. But the rhythm was wrong. Too slow, too deliberate. Told myself it was just an animal, maybe a deer or elk. But when I looked outside with my flashlight, there was nothing. Just those trees, and the shadows between them seemed darker than they should be, like they were thick enough to touch. I'm being ridiculous. This is exactly the kind of thinking I'm supposed to be studying objectively, not participating in. Confirmation bias, cultural contamination of perception, but I'm going back to the site today. I need to document that last symbol, the one on the northwest face of the rock. It's been bothering me. The way it's drawn, it almost looks like it's meant to be a door." That was the last entry. The remaining pages were blank. Chris set down the notebook and picked up Megan's camera, a professional-grade Canon with an enormous lens. He turned it on, grateful that she'd had enough battery life remaining. The LCD screen flickered to life and he began scrolling through the images. The first several dozen were standard documentation shots, wide angles of the landscape, close-ups of rock formations, detailed photographs of pictographs. Chris recognized some of the symbols from his cursory research into Blackfeet culture. Geometric patterns representing mountains, animals, celestial bodies. But as he continued through the images, he found the ones Megan had described, the anomalous symbols. They were painted in what looked like a mixture of red ochre and something darker, possibly blood, and they were indeed distorted versions of traditional imagery. A buffalo with its legs bent backward, a circle that should have represented the sun but had been turned inward on itself, creating a spiral that seemed to pull the eye down into its center. And then, on the northwest face of a large boulder, the symbol Megan had called a door. It was roughly 6 feet tall, composed of 2 parallel vertical lines connected by a series of horizontal marks that resembled ribs or ladder rungs. Within the space between the lines, there were handprints, dozens of them overlapping, each one painted in that dark reddish-black pigment. And in the center, at roughly head height, there was a single word scratched into the rock in English. Naha. Chris felt something cold move through his chest. "What does that mean?" "Naha?" Tom's voice was tight. "It's Blackfeet. Old language. It means hunger. Or more accurately, the hunger that cannot be satisfied. It's one of the names for..." He paused. "For something we don't talk about." "For what?" "The Wendigo." Chris had heard the word before, though his knowledge was limited to popular culture. Horror movies, Stephen King novels, the general understanding that it was some kind of cannibalistic monster from Native American mythology. I thought that was more of an Algonquin thing from back east, Canadian tribes. "The concept exists in many indigenous cultures," Tom said quietly. "Different names, similar warnings. Among my people, we have stories about those who violate the sacred prohibition against consuming human flesh. The act transforms them body and spirit. They become something else, something that can never be full, never satisfied. They hunger eternally." He finally met Chris's eyes. "And they hunt eternally. That's..." Chris stopped himself before he said ridiculous or superstition. Tom clearly believed what he was saying, and dismissing it wouldn't help find Megan. Instead, he said, "So you think Megan stumbled onto evidence of some kind of cannibalistic cult using this site for rituals?" "I think she found something that should have been left alone." Chris turned back to the camera, scrolling forward through the images. More photographs of the door symbol, taken from various angles. Then a series of shots showing the area around the boulder. dense pine forest, heavy undergrowth, shadows that seemed unnaturally deep. And then an image that made Chris's breath catch. It was blurred, taken hastily, as though Megan had spun suddenly and fired the shutter without time to focus. The frame showed the forest behind the ceremonial site, and in the middle distance, partially obscured by trees, there was a figure. Tall, impossibly tall, at least 7 or 8 feet, thin to the point of emaciation, with limbs that seemed too long, joints that bent at wrong angles. The face was indistinct in the blur, but Chris could make out what might have been eyes, pale and reflective, like an animal caught in a camera flash. And around the figure's mouth there was darkness, as though it had been eating something that left stains. "Jesus Christ," Chris whispered. Tom leaned in to look at the screen, and his face went gray. "We need to leave. Now. I need to find Megan. Mr. Marsh, I am telling you as both a park ranger and as someone whose family has lived in this territory for more generations than you can count. We need to leave this place while we still can." Chris felt anger flare, hot and familiar. This was the part of missing persons cases he hated most, the moment when people gave up, when they decided that superstition and fear were more important than an actual human life. "I'm not leaving without her. If you want to go back, go. Tell me how to get to this ceremonial site and I'll go alone. You don't understand what you're dealing with. Then explain it to me. Without the cultural mysticism, without the ghost stories. Give me facts." Tom was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was different, harder, stripped of the careful politeness he'd maintained until now. "Facts. Fine. In the winter of 1883, there was a hunting party from my tribe. 7 men, experienced, strong. They went up into what's now the park following game. They were gone for 2 weeks. When they came back, there were only 3 of them, and they were..." He paused, choosing words carefully. "Changed. They wouldn't speak about what happened, but they were starving. Literally dying of starvation even though they'd clearly eaten something recently. Their teeth were broken, their nails torn. They died within days, all 3 of them, and my great-great-grandfather, who was a healer, said they died of hunger despite eating constantly. Their bodies couldn't process food anymore, couldn't accept anything except one specific substance. And what was that? You know what it was, Mr. Marsh. You're a smart man. You've seen the symbol, heard the name." Chris wanted to laugh, wanted to dismiss this entire conversation as primitive superstition clouding a straightforward case. But he found he couldn't. Something about the way Tom spoke, the weight of genuine fear in his words, made mockery impossible. "Even if I accepted your story, which I don't, how does it help me find Megan?" "It doesn't. Because if the hunger that walks has taken her, she's already gone. And if she's not already gone, then she's being changed. Either way, going to that site won't save her. It'll just give it another victim. I don't believe in monsters. That doesn't matter. They believe in you." Chris stared at the ranger for a long moment, then carefully packed Megan's camera into his own backpack, along with her notebooks and laptop. "Give me directions to the site, please." Tom sighed, the sound of a man who'd known this was coming and had hoped to be wrong. 3 miles north-northeast. Follow the creek upstream until you reach a beaver dam, then cut east through the pines. You'll know the site when you see it. There's a clearing with a large boulder in the center about 12 feet high. The pictographs are on the north and west faces." He pulled a radio from his belt and handed it to Chris. "Take this. It's got a range of about 5 miles in these mountains. If you need help, real help, emergency extraction, you call me. And Mr. Marsh, if you see that thing from the photograph, if you see anything that doesn't look right, you run. You don't try to understand it, you don't try to communicate with it, you don't try to save anyone. You just run." "I'll keep that in mind," Chris said, though they both knew he wouldn't. Tom left the clearing without another word, and Chris found himself alone in the oppressive silence of Megan's abandoned camp. He spent another 20 minutes documenting the site, taking photographs, making notes, maintaining the methodical approach that had always served him well. But he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, that something in the trees was observing him with patience and hunger. He shouldered his pack and set out north-northeast, following the creek. The hike should have taken an hour, maybe 90 minutes with the elevation gain. Chris was in good shape for 34, maintained a regular running schedule, and had plenty of backcountry experience. But something about the terrain felt wrong, as though the forest was deliberately obscuring the path, forcing him into detours and switchbacks that shouldn't have been necessary. The creek seemed to meander more than it should, doubling back on itself in ways that defied the topography. Twice, Chris found himself back at landmarks he'd already passed, despite being certain he'd been moving steadily forward. By the time he found the Beaver Dam, the sun was dropping toward the western peaks, and he'd been hiking for nearly 3 hours. His phone, an iPhone 3G that was cutting-edge technology in 2009, showed no signal, which wasn't surprising given the remoteness. He'd brought a GPS unit as backup, but even that seemed confused, the satellite lock flickering in and out as though something was interfering with the signal. Chris turned east into the pines, and the temperature dropped noticeably. The trees here were older, thicker, their branches interlocking overhead to create a canopy so dense that the afternoon light barely penetrated. The forest floor was carpeted with decades of fallen needles, muffling his footsteps. And the silence, that oppressive, unnatural silence, was total. He found the clearing 15 minutes later, though he nearly walked past it. The trees seemed to close around it, making it almost invisible until he was practically standing at the edge. In the center, exactly as Tom had described, was the boulder, a massive granite monolith that looked like it had been dropped from the sky rather than weathered from the surrounding bedrock. The pictographs were visible even from a distance, dark stains against the gray stone. Chris approached slowly, every instinct screaming that this was wrong, that he should turn back. But those instincts weren't rational, and he refused to be ruled by irrational fear. Megan had been here. Megan had seen something important enough to risk her career on, and Megan was missing. Those were facts. Everything else was noise. The symbols were even more disturbing up close. The paint, if it was paint, had a texture that made Chris's skin crawl, sticky and organic. The handprints overlapping the door symbol were all roughly the same size, adult human, and he could see the individual ridge patterns in some of them, as though they'd been pressed against the rock with enough force to leave dermal impressions. He photographed everything, maintaining professional detachment even as his hands started to shake. On the ground near the base of the boulder, he found Megan's field vest, the multi-pocketed photographer's vest she'd been wearing in all her faculty photos. It was torn, not cut, and there were dark stains on the fabric that might have been blood. Her name was embroidered on the chest pocket in neat script. Chris picked it up carefully, checking the pockets. Empty except for a few energy bar wrappers and a small notebook, different from the ones at camp. This one was pocket-sized, the kind meant for quick field observations. He opened it and found a single entry, scrawled in handwriting that had lost all of Megan's usual precision. "It's not a door, it's a mouth. I can hear it breathing. God help me, I can hear all of them breathing. The trees aren't trees anymore. The shadows have teeth. I tried to leave, but the forest won't let me go, keeps turning me around, bringing me back here. It wants me to go through, wants me to feed the hunger. I can feel it in my head now, whispering, promising. If I just give in, if I just accept, the fear will stop. The hunger makes sense. The hunger is honest. The hunger is..." The entry ended mid-sentence, the pen having torn through the paper. Chris felt his heart hammering against his ribs, felt sweat break out across his skin despite the cold. This wasn't right. This entire situation had moved beyond the boundaries of rational investigation into something else, something that his 17 years of experience had no framework for understanding. Megan hadn't been abducted by a person. She hadn't gotten lost or injured. She'd encountered something that had broken her mind before it took her body. He pulled out Tom's radio, thumb hovering over the call button. But what would he say? That he'd found a vest and a disturbing note? That wasn't evidence of an immediate threat. It wasn't grounds for emergency extraction. It was just more data in a case that was rapidly becoming incomprehensible. The sun dropped below the western peaks, and the clearing was suddenly full of shadows. Long shadows, deep shadows, shadows that moved even though nothing cast them. Chris turned slowly, scanning the tree line. Nothing. Just forest. Just pines and underbrush and the gathering dark. But his peripheral vision kept catching movement, things that vanished the moment he looked directly at them. And now that the sun was down, he could hear something, a sound so faint it might have been his imagination, but once he noticed it, he couldn't stop hearing it. Breathing. Not his own breathing, though his was rapid and shallow with adrenaline. This was slower, deeper. The sound of something large drawing air through a throat that shouldn't exist, and it was coming from multiple directions at once, as though he was surrounded by whatever was making the sound. The radio crackled, making Chris jump. Tom's voice came through, distorted by static. "Mr. Marsh, it's getting dark. What's your status?" Chris pressed the transmit button. "I'm at the site. Found some of Megan's gear. No sign of her, but..." He paused, unsure how to explain what he was experiencing. "Tom, is there any wildlife in this area that makes a sound like heavy breathing?" The static intensified, and for a moment, Chris thought he'd lost the signal. Then Tom's voice returned, tight with urgency. "Get out of there. Right now. Don't ask questions, don't investigate further. Just move. Head back the way you came, and don't stop for anything." "Tom, I need more information." "What am I?" "It's found you. It's hunting. Move now." The transmission cut off, replaced by pure static. Chris looked at the radio, then back at the clearing. The boulder seemed different now, larger somehow, its surface no longer reflecting the last of the twilight but absorbing it, becoming a well of darkness in the center of the space. And the symbols, the door, the handprints, they were glowing faintly, pulsing with a bioluminescent light that shouldn't exist. The breathing grew louder. Chris ran. He crashed through the underbrush, following what he thought was the path he'd taken into the clearing. But the forest had changed. Trees that should have been familiar landmarks were gone, replaced by different trees in different arrangements. The beaver dam was nowhere to be found. The creek had vanished. Everything was wrong, twisted, as though space itself had been rearranged while he'd been focused on the boulder. Behind him, something moved through the trees. Something large. He could hear branches breaking, could hear the wet, labored breathing, closer now. Much closer. "Don't look back," Chris told himself. "If you look back, you'll see it. And if you see it, it becomes real. This is panic. This is fear. This is your primate brain taking over rational thought. Keep moving, find a landmark, reorient. Standard wilderness survival." But his primate brain knew something his rational mind refused to accept. He was prey. For the first time in his adult life, Christopher Marsh was being hunted by something that existed higher on the food chain than he did. The trees opened suddenly into a different clearing, smaller than the one with the boulder. Chris stumbled to a stop, chest heaving, and found himself looking at something that made his analytical mind simply shut down. There were bones, hundreds of them, thousands. They filled the clearing in cairns and arrangements, some obviously animal, deer, elk, bear, but others unmistakably human. Skulls were stacked like cordwood. Femurs had been driven into the ground to create a perimeter fence. And in the center, arranged in a rough circle, there were personal belongings. Backpacks, hiking boots, cameras, cell phones, a memorial to the missing. Chris recognized Megan's orange backpack immediately. He'd seen it in her faculty photo. He moved toward it without thinking, operating on automatic, his conscious mind having taken a temporary vacation from reality. The backpack was empty, except for one item, Megan's satellite phone, still powered on. There was a voice message indicator. Chris's hand shook as he played it. Megan's voice, terrified but trying to maintain composure. "If anyone finds this, listen carefully. The pictographs, they're not historical. They're instructions. A ritual that creates, God, I don't even know what to call it. A doorway? A transformation? The Blackfeet stories say that those who practice forbidden ceremonies, who consume human flesh in mockery of the sacred, they become vessels for the hunger spirit. The Wendigo isn't a creature. It's a state of being. It's what happens when you violate the deepest taboo. Olympic National Park, Washington State, October 2014. The call came through at 6:47 a.m., just as Robert Chen was pouring his second cup of coffee. The voice on the other end was fractured, a man struggling to hold himself together through sheer force of will. Ranger Chen, my name is David Hartley. My daughter, Lauren, she's been missing for 18 hours in the Enchanted Valley area. The initial search team, they came back. They said the conditions were too dangerous, that they'd resume at first light, but that was hours ago, and no one's... The voice cracked. Please. They gave me your name. They said if anyone could find her, it would be you. Robert's fingers tightened around the mug. Through the window of his cabin, the dense canopy of the Hoh rainforest stretched endlessly, morning mist threading through the Sitka spruces like something alive. He knew exactly why they'd given Hartley his name, and he resented it. Mr. Hartley, I'm sure the team is preparing to. She's 23 years old. She's doing her graduate research on endemic mosses. She called me yesterday morning, excited about some specimens she'd found near Pony Bridge. That was the last time I heard her voice. A pause, heavy with desperation. Please, I know about what happened to you 5 years ago. I know you found that hiker when no one else could. I know people say things about how you found him. Robert closed his eyes. The ceramic mug was warm against his palms, solid and real. What people say and what actually happened are two different things. I don't care how you find her. I just need you to try. 20 minutes later, Robert was loading his pack in the ranger station parking lot when Sarah Mitchell, the chief ranger, emerged from the building. Her expression was carefully neutral, the look she'd perfected over the 5 years since the Grayson incident. You're actually going, she said. Not a question. Man's daughter is missing. The SAR team will mobilize in an hour. You don't have to do this alone. Robert adjusted the straps on his pack, checking his gear by muscle memory. GPS unit, satellite phone, first aid kit, emergency shelter, water purification tablets, flares. He'd added extra batteries for his headlamp. The Enchanted Valley Trail was notorious for its canopy density. Daylight struggled to penetrate even at noon. 18 hours is a long time, he said. If she's injured, hypothermic. Sarah stepped closer, lowering her voice. Robert, you haven't taken a solo assignment since 2009. Everyone understands why. You don't need to prove anything. He met her gaze. I'm not trying to prove anything. I'm trying to find someone's daughter. The trailhead elevation read 1,240 feet. Robert marked his departure time, 7:43 a.m. in the logbook, and started up the eastern approach to Enchanted Valley. The path followed the East Fork Quinault River, the sound of rushing water constant and disorienting. Moss covered everything. Trees, rocks, the decomposing nurse logs that formed the forest's foundation. The air tasted green and ancient. Lauren Hartley had last been seen by a group of backpackers near mile marker 8.2, approximately 4 miles from where the valley opened up. Robert maintained a steady pace, his eyes scanning for signs. Broken vegetation, disturbed soil, anything artificial in this overwhelmingly natural landscape. The GPS coordinates from Lauren's last cell signal put her near Pony Bridge, but signals were unreliable here. The valley walls acted like a funnel, distorting electromagnetic waves, creating phantom readings. At mile 6.3, Robert stopped. On the trail ahead, a scuff mark in the mud, fresh, from a hiking boot, size 7 or 8, consistent with a woman's footprint. He photographed it, marked the coordinates. Then he noticed something else. The ferns beside the trail were bent, as if someone had stepped off the path. He followed the disturbance 15 feet into the forest where he found a small clearing. In the center, Lauren Hartley's field notebook lay open, pages rippling in the breeze. Robert crouched beside it, careful not to touch. The last entry was dated yesterday, 2:15 p.m. Bryophyte samples collected from north-facing slope. Unusual concentration of Schistostega pinnata, goblin gold moss. Local folklore claims area is cursed, typical superstition around bioluminescent organisms. Need to return tomorrow for soil pH analysis. Below this, written in different ink and shakier handwriting, voices, voices, why are there voices? Robert's breath caught. He keyed his radio. Base, this is Chen. I've located evidence of the missing person at coordinates 47.7584 north, 123.4892 west. Field notebook recovered. Subject may be experiencing auditory disturbances. Continuing search heading northwest toward Valley proper. Static answered him. He adjusted the frequency, tried again. Nothing. He checked his watch, 9:17 a.m. He was only 6 miles in, he shouldn't be out of range yet. The satellite phone. He pulled it from his pack, powered it up. The screen flickered, displaying a weak signal, then died completely despite the full battery indicator he'd verified that morning. Robert stood slowly, scanning the forest. The mist had thickened, reducing visibility to perhaps 30 feet. The river's sound had changed pitch, or maybe he'd moved farther from it than he'd realized. He oriented himself by compass, northwest, toward the valley. He'd bushwhack if necessary. Lauren was close. She had to be. Lauren Hartley. His voice sounded flat, absorbed by the dense vegetation. This is Ranger Robert Chen. If you can hear me, make noise. Signal your position. He waited. The forest offered no response except the whisper of wind through the canopy and the distant murmur of water over stone. Then, Robert? He spun toward the sound. A woman's voice, clear and close, coming from deeper in the trees. Lauren? He moved toward it, pushing through sword ferns. Robert, I'm here. I can't find the trail. He stopped. Something was wrong. The voice was familiar, but it wasn't a stranger's voice. It was, Robert, please. It's so dark here. His hands were shaking. No, it couldn't be. Not again. I'm cold, Robert. Why didn't you come sooner? The voice belonged to Marcus Grayson, the hiker he'd found 5 years ago, 3 days after the man had fallen from the Lillian Ridge Trail. Robert had found him in a location the GPS had insisted was impossible, following something he couldn't explain, hadn't tried to explain. Marcus had been alive when Robert reached him barely, and had died in the helicopter before they'd cleared the valley. If this story is grabbing your attention, follow for more quality content. What would you do in Robert's situation? Share your thoughts. Robert forced air into his lungs. Auditory hallucinations. Stress. The isolation. The pressure. His own unresolved trauma manifesting. Textbook psychology. He'd been through therapy after the Grayson incident. He knew what this was. You're not real, he said to the empty forest. But I am, Robert. You know I am. You've always known. That's why you came back here. That's why you couldn't stay away. He turned in a slow circle. The mist had become fog, thick and mobile. The tree trunks around him looked wrong, too twisted, too close together. He checked his compass. The needle was spinning lazily, unable to settle on magnetic north. Robert pulled out his backup compass. Same problem. He looked up, trying to find the sun's position through the canopy, but the light was uniform and sourceless, gray filtering through layers of green. Think. He was 6.3 miles from the trailhead following the river. The river was his landmark. He just needed to find it again, reorient himself, continue the search properly. He moved in what he believed was south, toward the sound of water. After 50 feet, the sound seemed farther away. He corrected, moving east. The sound faded further. Robert. This time it was his mother's voice speaking in Mandarin. She'd been dead for 12 years. Buyao wang leni da yin guo wo de shi. Don't forget what you promised me. He'd promised her at her deathbed that he'd stop trying to prove himself, that he'd accept his limitations, that he'd stop seeking answers where there were none. You're not my mother, he said in English. You're not Marcus. You're an auditory hallucination caused by stress and environmental factors. Your synapses misfiring in my temporal lobe. Laughter echoed through the trees. Not his mother's or Marcus's, but Lauren's, young and bright and terrified. "Help me! Please, someone help me!" Robert ran toward it. Ferns whipped against his legs. Moss-covered logs appeared suddenly in the fog, forcing him to vault over them or dodge around them. His rational mind screamed that he was making everything worse, that he was getting more lost, but he couldn't stop. Lauren was real. She was out here, scared and alone, and he was the only one looking for her. He broke through into another clearing, chest heaving. In the center stood a western red cedar, easily 800 years old, its trunk 12 feet in diameter. Carved into the bark, 6 feet up, were words in a language he didn't recognize. Below them, in English, fresher cuts, "The mist takes what it wants." At the tree's base, a pile of objects, a rusted compass, a water-stained map, a child's toy truck, a wedding ring, a cell phone. Modern, the screen shattered. Robert picked up the phone. No power. He tried anyway, pressing buttons uselessly. "You won't find her." Marcus's voice again, right behind him. Robert didn't turn around. "Why are you doing this?" "We're not doing anything. We're just here. We've always been here. The valley remembers everything it takes. Every lost hiker, every ranger who came looking. It remembers you, Robert. It's been waiting for you to come back." "Lauren Hartley," Robert said clearly, "is a real person who needs real help. Not a ghost story. Not local folklore." "Is that what you tell yourself? That what happened with Marcus was explainable? You followed my voice for 3 miles in the wrong direction, Robert. The search grid had already covered that area twice. There was no reason for me to be there, but you knew exactly where to find me, and now you know why." Robert turned around. Nothing was there, just fog and trees and the eternal green of the rainforest. But in the mist, shapes suggested themselves, human figures, standing motionless, watching. His training reasserted itself. He was experiencing a psychological episode triggered by environmental stressors and past trauma. The solution was to remove himself from the environment, return to base, allow the SAR team to continue the search with proper support and equipment. He checked his GPS. The screen showed his position as 47.7691 north, 123.856 west, approximately 2 miles northwest of where he'd found Lauren's notebook. But he'd been walking for hours. He should be farther than that, and the elevation reading showed 3,240 feet, which was impossible. Enchanted Valley's floor sat between 1,500 and 2,000 feet. "Technology lies here," his mother's voice said softly. "The old ways know better. Listen to what's underneath the surface. That's what I taught you." She had, in fact, taught him that. On their camping trips when he was young, before she'd gotten sick, she'd told him stories about the spirits in wild places. Not the sanitized versions from children's books, but the ones her grandmother had told her, about entities that existed in the margins between human understanding and natural law. "When you can't trust your instruments," she'd said, "trust your instincts. The body knows things the mind won't accept." Robert closed his eyes. Without the visual input of the fog-shrouded forest, he could feel the slope of the ground beneath his feet, downward toward the southwest, toward the valley proper. His ears, freed from the distraction of trying to see, picked up the river's sound, closer than he'd thought, off to his left. He opened his eyes and walked, ignoring the GPS, ignoring the compass, following the subtle pull of gravity and water. Within 10 minutes, he emerged onto the main trail at mile 8.8, just below Pony Bridge. The fog was thinner here, the visibility perhaps 60 feet. The bridge itself was a simple wooden structure spanning the East Fork Quinault, 40 feet long, weathered gray. And on the far side, standing perfectly still, was Lauren Hartley. She wore a green rain jacket and mud-stained hiking pants. Her dark hair hung loose around her face. She was staring directly at him. "Lauren!" Robert started across the bridge, relief flooding through him. "Are you injured? Can you walk?" She didn't respond, didn't move. As he got closer, he saw that her eyes were wrong, unfocused, pupils dilated despite the dim light. Lauren, my name is Robert Chen. I'm a park ranger. Your father sent me to find you. You're going to be okay. My father, she repeated, voice flat. David Hartley, 52 years old, lives in Portland, teaches history at Reed College. He called you this morning at 6:47 a.m. Robert stopped 6 feet away. That's right. He's very worried about you. You promised your mother you'd stop looking for answers where there are none. Her name was May Chen. She died in 2002 of pancreatic cancer. You were at her bedside. She spoke to you in Mandarin. His blood felt strange in his veins, both hot and cold. How do you know that? Lauren's head tilted, the movement too precise, too controlled. Marcus Grayson fell from Lillian Ridge on October 18, 2009. Compound fracture of the left femur, punctured lung, internal bleeding. You found him in a location the search grid had marked as cleared. He died at 3:32 p.m. in medical helicopter N4117SR. The paramedic's name was James Wolcott. He told you not your fault before they took off. But you've never believed him. Robert's hand moved to his radio. Instinct overriding reason. Base, this is Chen. I've located the missing person, but... Lauren spoke over him, her voice unchanged. Your radio hasn't worked since you entered the forest. Your satellite phone's battery drained despite being fully charged. Your GPS shows impossible coordinates. You're 2 miles from the trail, but standing on the trail. You know what this means, Robert. You've always known. What are you? The question came out steadier than he felt. We're the space between breaths, the moment before sleep, the answer to questions you've stopped asking. Lauren's face remained expressionless. Lauren Hartley stepped off the trail 22 hours ago, following her father's voice. She heard him calling for help. She ran to him. She's been running ever since. Where is she? The real Lauren? She's here. She's always been here. Just like you've always been here, Robert, ever since that day with Marcus. You left something behind in this forest, and it's been pulling you back ever since. Robert forced himself to breathe evenly, to think. In his pack, emergency flares, a first aid kit, water purification tablets. Nothing that would help against whatever this was, entity, hallucination, manifestation of his breaking mind. But there was something else. His grandmother's jade pendant, the one his mother had given him before she died. He'd carried it for years, then stopped after Marcus, embarrassed by the superstition. He'd added it back to his gear last week, on impulse he hadn't examined. He reached into his jacket's inner pocket. The jade was warm, almost hot. Lauren, or what wore Lauren's face, took a step back. That won't change anything. We're already part of you. Maybe, Robert said. But I'm not part of you. He pulled out the pendant. In the dim light filtering through the canopy, the jade seemed to glow faintly green. His mother had told him jade protected against evil spirits, but more importantly, it helped the wearer see clearly. See what was real versus what was presented. He looked at Lauren through the jade's translucent surface. The thing standing before him was still Lauren, but it was also not Lauren. It was layers of people, faces shifting one into another. Marcus, his mother, other faces he didn't recognize, dozens of them, all the lost ones, all the voices, and behind them, in them, through them, something else. Not malevolent exactly, but utterly indifferent. An intelligence that existed in this place where technology failed and compasses spun uselessly, where time and space bent around it like water around a stone. You're a guardian, Robert said, understanding clicking into place. Or that's what you were once. Something the Kino people knew about. Something they respected enough to carve warnings about. The Lauren thing's expression didn't change, but something in the air shifted. We remember everything. Every person who enters thinking they can understand this place through their instruments and their maps. Every person who trusts their technology over their instincts. Where is Lauren? She's where all of them go. Into the green, into the mist, into us. Robert's hand closed around the jade. I don't accept that. He moved past the thing on the bridge, deliberately turning his back on it. an act that required every ounce of courage he had. On the far side, he closed his eyes again, holding the jade pendant. Felt for that pull, that sense his mother had taught him to trust. "Lauren Hartley," he shouted. "If any part of you can still hear me, make a sound. Fight it. Your father is waiting for you." Silence, then so faint he almost missed it. A whimper, weak and terrified, coming from below the bridge. Robert scrambled down the embankment. Beneath the bridge's structure, partially hidden by ferns and a fallen log, was Lauren. The real Lauren. Unconscious, hypothermic, her lips blue but breathing. Alive. He dropped beside her, checking her pulse, thread and rapid, pulling the emergency blanket from his pack. "Lauren, I'm Ranger Chen. You're going to be okay. I'm getting you out of here." Her eyes fluttered open, confused and glazed. My dad? He's waiting for you." Above him, on the bridge, footsteps. Slow and deliberate. Robert wrapped Lauren in the blanket, got his arms under her, lifted. She weighed almost nothing, or adrenaline made her seem to. He carried her up the embankment. The thing was still there, still wearing Lauren's face, but now Robert could see through it, see the forest beyond, the mist, the eternal green. It was fading, or he was learning to see past it. "You can't take her," it said, but the voice was uncertain now, fractured. "I already have." Robert walked forward. The thing didn't move. He passed through the space where it stood, felt a momentary cold, a sense of vast emptiness, and then he was past it, walking down the trail with the real Lauren in his arms. His radio crackled to life. "Chen, this is Base. Do you copy?" He fumbled for it one-handed. "Base, this is Chen. I have her. Hypothermic, potentially in shock, but alive. I'm at Pony Bridge, heading back down. I need medical at the trailhead." "Copy that, Chen. Medical helicopter is inbound. ETA 12 minutes." Behind him, the forest was just a forest. The fog was lifting. His GPS showed his actual position, his compass pointed reliably north. Lauren stirred against his chest. I heard so many voices. They knew everything about me." "I know," Robert said. "I heard them too." Were they real? He thought about that as he walked, his boots finding the trail easily now. "I don't know. Maybe that's not the right question. Maybe the question is whether we're real enough to resist them." Lauren was quiet for a moment. Then, "Thank you for not giving up." The helicopter was waiting when they emerged from the tree line 40 minutes later. David Hartley was there too, having driven through the night from Portland. Robert watched father and daughter embrace, watched the paramedics work with efficient calm, watched the helicopter lift off into the clearing sky. Sarah Mitchell appeared at his elbow. "Quite the rescue. The team found her field notebook where you marked it. They said your coordinates were perfect." "Just followed the evidence," Robert said. Her father said she was talking about voices, about the forest playing tricks on her. Classical hypothermia symptoms, confusion, auditory hallucinations. Sarah looked at him carefully. "Did you experience anything unusual out there?" Robert thought about the jade pendant still warm in his pocket, about the thing on the bridge, about Marcus Grayson and his mother and all the lost voices. "No," he said. "Nothing unusual. Just another day in the Olympic National Forest." But that night, alone in his cabin, he pulled out his old journals, found the entry from 5 years ago, from the day after he'd found Marcus Grayson, the entry he'd never shown anyone, never spoken about. "I followed his voice to a place the search grid had already cleared, but I knew he was there. How did I know? What did I actually hear in that forest? And why do I still feel like part of me never left?" Below it, he wrote a new entry. "Found Lauren Hartley today. Heard the voices again. This time I understood what they were. The forest's memory, its way of testing those who enter. Not evil, not benign, just present, ancient, real in a way that doesn't fit our definitions. I'm not leaving this job. I'm not running from it anymore. Because someone has to stand between what's out there and the people who don't understand it. Someone has to be able to hear the voices and still find the truth. Mom was right. Trust your instincts. The body knows things the mind won't accept. Tomorrow I start training the new rangers. I think I know what to teach them now. He closed the journal and looked out the window. The forest stretched endlessly into darkness, alive with mysteries that predated human understanding. Somewhere in that green expanse, the mist moved between the trees, patient and eternal. Robert Chen was no longer afraid of it. He was ready. Thank you for reading to the end. If you enjoyed this narrative, consider following for more engaging stories. What's your interpretation of what Robert truly encountered in Olympic National Forest? I'd love to read your theories in the comments. Tentar novamente. The radio crackled with static before Karen's voice cut through. Chris, we've got a situation. 22-year-old female Madison Foster failed to return from a solo day hike yesterday. Last known position was the Wheeler Peak Trail. Family's getting anxious. Christopher Hayes adjusted his grip on the steering wheel as his truck climbed the winding road into Great Basin National Park. 38 years old, 15 years with search and rescue, and he'd heard variations of this same call hundreds of times. Solo hiker, inexperienced, probably twisted an ankle or got disoriented when the sun started setting. By noon, they'd find her dehydrated and embarrassed, sitting beside the trail. Copy that. ETA 20 minutes. Weather? Clear now, but there's a front moving in tonight. You'll want to find her before then. Chris had worked Great Basin cases before, though not as many as Yosemite or Yellowstone. The park was Nevada's best-kept secret. Ancient bristlecone pines, limestone caves, and enough isolation to make people disappear if they weren't careful. Most tourists stuck to the scenic drives. The serious hikers, the ones who ventured into the backcountry, those were the ones who sometimes needed him. He pulled into the trailhead parking lot just after 9. Madison's car sat alone near the information board, a dented blue Honda with California plates and a university parking sticker. Chris photographed the vehicle, noted the license plate, then checked the trail register. Madison's entry from yesterday morning was neat, methodical. Wheeler Peak Summit Solo, return by 6 p.m. The handwriting was confident, optimistic. The last entry before hers was dated 3 days earlier. Chris shouldered his pack and started up the trail. The morning sun filtered through the aspen groves, painting everything in shades of gold and shadow. His boots found their rhythm on the well-maintained path. This was the part of the job he'd always loved, the solitude, the logical progression from point A to point B, the satisfaction of solving a problem that was fundamentally mathematical. People got lost because they made poor decisions or encountered bad luck. Find the decision point, trace the logic, locate the person. Simple. The first anomaly appeared at mile marker 2. A cairn sat beside the trail, but it wasn't one of the official park markers. Someone had stacked perhaps 30 stones into a spiral pattern, each rock carefully balanced. The formation was deliberate, almost artistic. Chris photographed it. Documentation was crucial, but didn't think much of it. Hikers built cairns all the time, though the Park Service discouraged it. What bothered him, what made him pause and crouch down for a closer look, were the markings. Someone had painted symbols on several of the stones in what looked like rust-red pigment, circles within circles, spiral patterns, a handprint, small and precise. Chris pulled out his radio. Karen, I'm at mile 2. Found an unusual cairn with painted symbols. Probably unrelated, but I'm documenting it. Copy. Madison's family says she was interested in Native American history, photography student working on a project about indigenous sacred sites. Something cold touched the back of Chris's neck. He straightened, scanning the forest around him. The wind had died completely. In 15 years of wilderness work, he'd developed instincts about places, about when something felt wrong. It was never anything he could articulate in a report, just a subtle wrongness in the air, a quality of silence that was too absolute. The forest was utterly still. No birds, no insects, nothing. Chris keyed the radio again. What kind of sacred sites? Static answered him. He adjusted the frequency, checked the battery. Full charge, clear sky, no reason for interference. Karen, do you copy? More static, and then faintly, something that might have been a voice but was too distorted to understand. The radio crackled once more and went dead. Chris felt the first real flicker of unease. Equipment failure happened, but the timing was too convenient. He pocketed the useless radio and continued up the trail, his pace quickening. Whatever was happening with his gear, Madison was still out here somewhere, and the temperature would drop 20 degrees after sunset. At mile 3, he found her backpack. It sat in the middle of the trail, upright and undisturbed, as if Madison had simply set it down and walked away. Chris approached carefully, photographing the scene from multiple angles before touching anything. The pack was a standard day hiker model, well used but maintained. When he opened it, everything was still inside. Water bottles, energy bars, a first aid kit, a professional-grade camera, even her wallet and phone. No one abandoned their pack voluntarily. Not with their water, not with their emergency supplies. Chris's unease crystallized into something sharper. This wasn't a lost hiker anymore. This was something else. He powered on Madison's phone. No signal, which was expected out here, but the photo gallery was accessible. Chris scrolled through the images with growing confusion. The first dozen were standard tourist shots, landscapes, bristlecone pines, the view from various elevations. Then the subject matter changed. Symbols painted on trees. More cairns, each larger than the last, decorated with that same rust-red pigment, and then the pictographs. Ancient rock art that Chris knew for certain wasn't supposed to be in this area of the park. The style was wrong, the placement impossible. Great Basin had some petroglyphs in the caves, but nothing like this. These were intricate, disturbing scenes of figures with elongated limbs and distorted proportions, painted on rock faces that Chris didn't recognize. The final photo made his hands go cold. It showed Madison herself, taken as a selfie, but the expression on her face was wrong. Her eyes were too wide, her mouth open in what might have been a scream, or might have been ecstasy. Behind her, barely visible in the gathering dusk, stood a figure, tall, impossibly thin, its proportions all wrong. The image quality was poor, the lighting bad, but Chris could make out what looked like antlers or branches growing from its head. The photo's timestamp was 7:43 p.m. yesterday, nearly 2 hours after Madison was supposed to be back at her car. Chris forced himself to think logically. Photo manipulation, mental health crisis, drug-induced hallucination. There were rational explanations. There were always rational explanations. 15 years had taught him that wilderness emergencies, no matter how strange they seemed initially, always resolved into understandable cause and effect. People got hurt, got lost, got scared. They didn't get taken by things with antlers, but the forest was still absolutely silent. Chris marked the pack's location with his GPS and continued up the trail. The path was steeper now, switchbacking through increasingly sparse vegetation. He was above 9,000 feet, and his breath came harder in the thin air. The bristlecone pines here were ancient, twisted into impossible shapes by centuries of wind. Some were over 3,000 years old, the park's literature claimed. They'd been saplings when the Shoshone people first came to these mountains. The Shoshone. Karen had mentioned sacred sites. Chris didn't know much about indigenous history beyond what the Park Service pamphlets offered. He knew the Shoshone had lived in this region for thousands of years before white settlement. He knew they'd been forcibly relocated in the 1800s. He knew that some of the older rangers spoke quietly about certain areas of the park that were best left alone, though they never elaborated. He'd always dismissed that as superstition. At mile 5, the official trail ended. A small sign warned hikers that continuing beyond this point required a wilderness permit and appropriate equipment. Chris had both, but Madison hadn't registered for a backcountry permit. According to her trail register entry, she should have turned around here. A faint path continued beyond the sign, barely visible, probably created by deer or the occasional adventurous hiker. Chris examined the ground and found what he was looking for: a boot print, small, consistent with a woman's size 7. Madison's permit application, which he'd reviewed before starting out, listed her height as 5'4". The print matched. She'd gone off trail. Chris followed. The path wound through a grove of twisted pines that seemed to lean toward him, their branches forming a canopy that blocked most of the sunlight. The temperature dropped noticeably. That silence he'd noticed before had become oppressive, a physical presence that pressed against his eardrums. His footsteps seemed too loud, echoing strangely in the still air. Then he saw the first offering. It hung from a low branch, a small leather pouch decorated with beadwork and feathers. Chris stopped, recognition firing through his organized mind. This was a medicine bundle, a sacred object in Shoshone culture. He'd seen examples in museums, though never in the wild. This one looked old, the leather weathered and cracked. 10 feet further, another bundle, then another. Soon Chris was walking through a forest festooned with them, dozens hanging from branches at various heights. Some were ancient, others looked newer. Offerings left across decades, perhaps centuries. The path he was following led directly through them. This was a sacred site, an active one. Chris had enough cultural sensitivity training to know he shouldn't be here. The protocols were clear. Indigenous sacred sites were to be respected, protected. But Madison had come this way and she was still missing, and the sun would set in 6 hours. He pressed forward. The path opened into a clearing that shouldn't have existed. Chris's geological knowledge told him this was wrong. The elevation was too high, the terrain too rocky for such a space. Yet here it was, a perfect circle perhaps 50 yards across, ringed by those ancient bristlecone pines. The ground was bare stone, smooth and level, marked with more of those painted symbols. Spirals within spirals, concentric circles. And at the center, a formation of stones arranged in a pattern that made Chris's eyes hurt to follow. The cairn was massive, perhaps 8 feet tall, constructed with a precision that seemed impossible without modern equipment. Each stone fit perfectly against its neighbors, forming a spiral that drew the eye inexorably toward its apex. The structure was covered in that rust-red pigment, painted in elaborate designs that seemed to shift and move when Chris wasn't looking directly at them. And scattered around the base were more offerings. Not just medicine bundles now, but bones. Animal skulls arranged in careful patterns, bundles of dried sage and tobacco, clay vessels filled with something dark and viscous. This wasn't just a sacred site. This was an active shrine. Madison's boot prints led directly to the cairn. Chris approached carefully, his heart hammering despite his attempts at rationalization. Archaeological site, he told himself. Probably illegal for him to be here, but that didn't matter right now. Find Madison, get her out. Report the location to the proper authorities. Simple. Logical. The bones at the cairn's base were fresh. Chris crouched down, his training overriding his growing fear. Deer, probably. Maybe elk. The skulls were stripped clean, bleached by sun and time. But the way they were arranged, each one facing outward, each positioned with mathematical precision, suggested human intervention. Recent intervention. There was no moss, no lichen growth. These had been placed within the last few days. And among them, impossible to miss, was Madison's camera. The device was smashed, lens shattered, but Chris recognized it from the photos on her phone. It sat in front of the largest skull, positioned as carefully as everything else in this place, as if it too were an offering. "Madison!" Chris's shout echoed strangely in the clearing, the sound seeming to bend and distort. "Madison Foster, can you hear me?" Silence. That absolute crushing silence. Chris circled the cairn, looking for any sign of where Madison might have gone. The boot prints ended at the stone formation. He could track them clearly up to the cairn's base, but beyond that, nothing. She'd simply vanished, as if the stones had swallowed her. Rational explanations. Chris clung to them like a drowning man clutching driftwood. Madison had been here, had left her camera, had walked away. The ground beyond the cairn was too rocky to hold prints, that was all. She'd continued in some direction, probably disoriented, possibly injured. He needed to search the perimeter, establish a grid pattern, apply proper search and rescue protocols. The sun was directly overhead now, but the clearing seemed darker than it should be. Chris pulled out his compass for a bearing and watched, confused, as the needle spun lazily without settling. He tapped the device, checked for magnetic interference. The needle continued its slow rotation, useless. He tried his GPS unit next. The screen flickered, showed his location as the middle of the Pacific Ocean, then went dark. All his equipment was failing. Every piece of technology he'd brought, everything he relied on, was systematically breaking down. "No," Chris said aloud, needing to hear a human voice, even his own. "This is explainable. Solar flare activity, magnetic anomaly. There's a geological explanation." But he didn't believe it. For the first time in 15 years, Christopher Hayes, the rational analyst who'd built his entire career on logic and evidence, felt the creeping certainty that he'd wandered into something that didn't follow rules he understood. The wind picked up suddenly, impossibly, howling through the clearing despite the forest remaining still. Chris felt it pull at his jacket, tug at his hair. But when he looked at the trees surrounding the space, their branches hung motionless. The wind existed only here, only in this circle of stones and bones and painted symbols. And in that wind, Chris heard voices. They were faint, speaking in a language he didn't know. But the tone was unmistakable, chanting, rhythmic, and hypnotic. The voices rose and fell in complex harmonies that hurt to hear, that seemed to bypass his ears entirely and resonate directly in his bones. Chris spun, trying to locate the source, but the sound came from everywhere and nowhere. The painted symbols on the stones began to glow. It was subtle at first, just a faint luminescence that Chris could have dismissed as a trick of the light, but it grew stronger, that rust-red pigment brightening to orange, then to a gold that pulsed in time with the chanting. The spirals seemed to rotate, the concentric circles to expand and contract like a breathing thing. "This isn't happening," Chris whispered. "This isn't real." But it was. Every sense, every instinct screamed at him that it was real, that he was standing in the presence of something ancient and powerful and utterly indifferent to his understanding of how the world worked. The air in front of the cairn rippled like heat shimmer on summer asphalt. Chris watched, unable to move, unable to look away, as the distortion grew more pronounced. Reality itself seemed to thin, to become translucent, and through that thinning veil, Chris saw a place that wasn't a place, a darkness that moved and breathed, figures with impossible proportions, tall and thin like the shape in Madison's photograph, moving through that darkness with fluid, predatory grace. And among them, Chris saw human forms, dozens of them, hundreds maybe, standing motionless with their eyes closed and their mouths open in silent screams. Madison was there. Chris recognized her from the photos on her phone, though she looked different now. Her skin had taken on a grayish pallor, and her eyes, though closed, seemed to move beneath the lids as if tracking something in a dream. She stood perfectly still, arms at her sides, barefoot on nothing Chris could see. She looked at peace. Terribly, wrongly at peace. "Madison!" Chris lurched forward, reaching for that rippling veil in reality. His hand passed through something that felt like ice water and electricity combined. The sensation shot up his arm, into his chest, and suddenly Chris understood. This was a doorway, a threshold between worlds. The Shoshone had known about it, had marked it, had left offerings to keep whatever was on the other side from crossing over. For thousands of years they'd maintained this place, respected it, feared it. And Madison, in her enthusiasm for indigenous sacred sites, in her desire to photograph something authentic and undiscovered, had violated every protection that had ever been placed here. She'd opened the door. The chanting grew louder, more insistent. Chris felt it pulling at him, inviting him to step through, to join Madison in that impossible darkness. Part of him wanted to. Part of him recognized that crossing would answer every question he'd ever had about what lay beyond the rational world he'd built his life around. But a larger part, the part that had kept him alive through 15 years of dangerous rescues, screamed at him to run. Chris stumbled backward, breaking contact with the veil. The clearing seemed to pulse around him, the symbols flaring bright enough to hurt. The chanting reached a crescendo, and through it, Chris heard another sound. Footsteps, many of them, moving through the forest toward the clearing. He turned and ran. Behind him, Chris heard laughter. Not human laughter. Nothing about the sound was human. It echoed through the trees, through his skull, through the spaces between his thoughts. It was the laughter of something that found his fear amusing, that had been waiting here for centuries, and would wait for centuries more. Chris crashed through the grove of offering-laden trees, his organized mind fragmenting under the weight of what he'd seen. This wasn't possible. None of it was possible. But he'd seen it, felt it, heard it. The evidence was irrefutable, even if it destroyed everything he thought he understood about the world. The official trail appeared ahead, that small sign marking the boundary between maintained path and wilderness. Chris didn't stop. He ran down the switchbacks, his pack slamming against his back, his lungs burning in the thin air. He ran past the place where Madison's backpack sat waiting to be found, past the elaborate cairn with its painted symbols, past the trailhead and into the parking lot. His truck sat where he'd left it. Madison's Honda sat beside it. The normal world, the rational world, the world that made sense. Chris's radio crackled to life. Chris, are you there? You've been out of contact for 6 hours. What's your status? 6 hours. He'd been gone 6 hours, though it had felt like 2 at most. Chris struggled to form words. I found evidence of Madison's route. She went off trail into a sacred site. Karen, we need to contact the Shoshone tribes. We need their elders. Chris, slow down. Are you injured? Did you find Madison? How could he explain? How could he put into a coherent report what he'd witnessed? Chris looked down at his hands and saw they were shaking. His rational mind, that careful, logical instrument he'd honed for decades, was still trying to process what his senses had experienced. No, he said finally. I didn't find her, but I know where she is. Where? Chris looked back at the trailhead, at the path that led up into those ancient mountains toward that clearing that shouldn't exist and the door that should never have been opened. Somewhere else, he whispered. The investigation that followed was extensive. Search teams combed the area for weeks. Madison's case made national news. Her family offered rewards. Theories proliferated. Abduction, animal attack, voluntary disappearance, murder. Chris was interviewed dozens of times. He told them about the backpack, the camera, the off-trail route. He marked the sacred site on maps, though when rangers returned to check, they found nothing but ordinary forest. The clearing had vanished, if it had ever truly existed. Chris didn't mention what he'd seen through that veil. He didn't describe the doorway or the figures moving in the darkness. Who would believe him? He hardly believed it himself, except during the nights when he lay awake and heard that chanting in his memory, felt that pull toward something vast and incomprehensible. He took a leave of absence from search and rescue, saw a therapist who diagnosed acute stress reaction. The rational part of his mind, the part he'd always trusted, told him to accept this explanation. Stress, altitude sickness, dehydration, all could cause hallucinations. What he'd experienced had been a mental break, nothing more. But Chris knew better. He'd spent 3 months researching Shoshone cosmology, reading everything he could find about their beliefs regarding the spirit world. The Numu, they called them. Spirit beings that existed in a realm parallel to the physical world. The Shoshone had always known there were places where the boundary between worlds grew thin, where offerings had to be made to keep the balance, to prevent those ancient spirits from reaching through. Madison's disappearance hadn't been the first. Chris found records going back over a century. Hikers and prospectors and rangers who'd vanished in Great Basin without a trace, all in the same general area, all during specific times of year when the veil, according to Shoshone calendars, was thinnest. The Park Service had cordoned off that section of Wheeler Peak Trail, citing unstable geological conditions. Chris knew it was a lie, knew that somewhere in the bureaucratic chain someone else understood what that place really was. They'd keep it closed, keep people away, maintain the fiction that it was just an ordinary patch of wilderness. But every year, during the equinoxes, Chris felt the pull. He'd wake from dreams of that clearing, of those symbols glowing in the darkness, of Madison standing peacefully among the stolen. The rational part of him, what remained of it, argued against returning. But the new understanding he'd gained, the certainty that the world was far stranger and more terrible than he'd ever imagined, whispered that maybe Madison was still there, still waiting, still standing in that impossible space between realities. If this story is giving you chills, follow for more quality terror. Could you survive in Chris's place? On the anniversary of Madison's disappearance, Chris drove back to Great Basin. He parked at the same trailhead, looked up at the mountains bathed in autumn sunlight. Rangers had found his information about the sacred site concerning enough to consult with tribal elders who'd performed ceremonies at the park boundary. They'd asked Chris to stay away, told him that some doors once noticed never truly closed for those who'd seen through them. He believed them, but he also knew that Madison Foster's family deserved answers, even if those answers existed outside the rational world he'd once inhabited, and deep down, in a place that 15 years of search and rescue had never touched. Chris understood that he needed to know if what he'd seen was real, or if his mind had simply shattered under the weight of an ordinary tragedy. The trail beckoned, the mountains waited, and somewhere in that ancient wilderness, where the boundary between worlds grew thin and the Numunu danced in the spaces between, a door remained open. Christopher Hayes, analyst and rationalist, shouldered his pack and began to climb. Behind him, a raven called out, once, twice, 3 times. In Shoshone belief, ravens were messengers between worlds, carriers of warnings from the spirits to the living. Chris didn't look back. He'd spent his entire life believing in evidence and cause and effect, in the supremacy of logic over superstition. That life was over. Whatever happened next, whatever he found in that clearing that shouldn't exist, he would finally have proof. One way or another, he would understand. The forest swallowed him whole. The raven called again. And in the shadows between the bristlecone pines, something ancient stirred and waited with infinite patience, as it had waited for thousands of years, as it would wait for thousands more. Some doors should never be opened. Chris had learned that too late. Now, walking back toward that threshold between worlds, he wondered if some doors, once opened, could ever truly be closed again. The mountain had no answer. Only silence, absolute and consuming, broken occasionally by the whisper of wind through ancient pines and the distant echo of chanting that might have been memory or might have been invitation. Hope you felt real chills. If you appreciate genuine horror, consider following. Which moment scared you most?